Now we're going to actually go in and edit some of the code. So we have two options to open scripts in Unity. In the project panel, we can just double click on the script where it's listed in the folder, or we can select the component by grabbing our game object, going down to where our component is listed, and double clicking on where it says player controller in this grayed out box. Let's go ahead and do that. Double click on the script to open it up, and it should automatically open Visual Studio for you. We'll briefly go over what's happening in this script before we get into actually editing it. Every script in Unity at the very top is going to feature these three lines of code. These are what are called includes. We are basically telling this script that we want to use code from our system and from the Unity engine. At the very top, underneath those, you'll see a public class player controller mono behavior. What this is this defines this code inside of these curly brackets as the player controller. This text here must always match the name of our file. If this text doesn't match the file name exactly, it's going to cause some errors for you. Now at the top beneath our class, you'll see 4 of what are called variables. Variables are references to objects that we can change and manipulate as we see fit. There's a lot of different types of variables. In fact, there are hundreds of thousands of them we could use, but the important ones we want to worry about right now are this float move speed. A float is a type of number that allows us to include a decimal value. Not all numbers are the same in coding. There are multiple different types of number variables, but the float number is what we want to use here, as it allows us to be very precise with what we want our move speed to be. We declare a variable by typing the type of variable we want first. So in this case, we want a float, so we type float. We then give it a name, so we say space move speed, which gives us the name, and then in this case, we want to define a default value. Some variables don't have a value to start with. For example, just below our move speed variable, we have a car control or character controller variable. We can't actually assign a value to this one because it's referencing a component. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But for things that are numbers, we can actually just give them a default value by saying equal sign and then the number we want. You might think that this is a typo, having the F after our 5 here, but what we're actually saying is that we want to use 5 as a float. So float starts with the letter F. 5 at the end of a whole number tells us that we're using this as a float. Whole numbers in code typically are actually what are called integers. Integer values are numbers that do not have decimals. So it could be like 0, 1, 2, or something like that, but it could not be 2.4 or 1.6. So float numbers allow us to have some decimal value precision. We're actually going to look exactly how we're using our move speed variable here. So if I highlight this in my code, it'll also highlight wherever it's being used. And if we scroll down a little bit, we see move speed's highlighted here at this movement variable. So movement, if we scroll up, is another variable we've defined, and it's a vector 3. Vector 3 values are essentially 3 numbers, a x, y, and z, just like in Unity are transform values. All of 3 of these, position, rotation, and scale, are vector 3 values. That means that they're one variable, but they hold 3 numbers. Those 3 numbers are stored as the x, y, and z components of the vector 3. So whenever we use a vector 3 in code, we actually have access to that x, y, and z value. So you'll see in the update method, which a method is another chunk of code that is defined by these curly brackets, you'll see we have movement.z equals 0, which is setting the z component of that movement vector 3 to a value of 0. All the code here is doing is basically checking to see if we get a specific button pressed down. And if we do, then we multiply the value we get from pressing the button times our move speed. those values will almost always be equal to 1, so multiplying that by our move speed is going to set it basically equal to our move speed. So in this case, our move speed starts at 5, so any value that we have here is going to be set equal to positive or negative 5. So if we were to, with this component now on our player, if we were to go back to our game and hit play, and press the W key or the S key, you'll see us move around just like that. We can't jump or anything, but we can run and walk around our level. Now you may have noticed our player is moving very, very slowly, so we want to have the ability to change that. So in the code, what we're going to do is take our float move speed value and we're going to do what's called exposing it. And what that means is we're going to convert this float value or float variable from a private variable to a public variable. Any variable in Unity that has no word before the variable type, so if it just says float or just says character controller or just says vector3, those are what are called private values. And that means the only way to change them is to change them inside of our code. But what we can do if we want to be able to change it somewhere else is click right in front of the float word and type public and add a space afterwards. And what that's going to do is what's called exposing this variable. We can now do two things. If we somehow get what's called a reference to this script from another bit of code, that is to edit this code from a different piece of code, we can now change move speed. But making a value public also makes it visible in the editor. So now you'll see after we save this script, after adding public, so to save you can press Control or Command S or click this little floppy disk icon up here at the top of Visual Studio. You'll notice if you make changes that there'll be a little star here next to your script, so if you save you'll see the star disappear. But once the script is saved, we can click back over into Unity. And now you'll see on our player controller script we have a value of 5 and the move speed variable is visible. What we can do now is change this value here, and the code itself won't update, but the value that is used inside the code will. So if I press play with that set to 10, now you'll see I move twice as fast. One thing to note is that you can actually change that value while you're playing, but it won't save any changes you make. So to get your mouse cursor back while you're playing, you press the escape key. And let's say I set this move speed value to 300 and then click back in and start running around. Clearly this is maybe a little bit too fast, and that's okay. But what we want to do is press escape again and then press the play button, and then you'll see that goes back to whatever it was set to before we press the play button. So if you ever change a value while you're playing, keep in mind that it's going to get reset. And this is true for any component, not just scripts.